There are machines history loves, and there are those still argued over as if the battle ended yesterday. The F4U Corsair is exactly the second kind. One man looks at that silhouette and sees the most beautiful fighter of its age. Another curls his lip and remembers the nickname that sends a chill down the spine: the Ensign Eliminator. Which of them is right? Today you will learn everything. Good day, friends. What stands before us is not merely an aircraft. It is a riddle with a broken wing, a machine its own pilots feared more than any enemy in the air. The fastest carrier fighter of its time, and at the same time an outcast the Navy refused to see on its decks. How is that even possible? This relates to one of the strangest fates in the history of world aviation. A machine with fantastic numbers sent into exile. A fighter barred from the carrier deck, which would later save that very deck. An aircraft that ran ahead of its time in one war and arrived hopelessly late to another. And all of it, one and the same design, one name, one temper, heavy and untamed. Remember this figure. For every machine lost in combat, 1.5 were wrecked through the pilot's own errors. 1.5, meaning the Corsair destroyed its own more often than the enemy, and still the airmen would not part with it. Why? What devilish allure lived in that broken wing? This relates to the very heart of our story. Today we will walk the whole road, from the drawing board of a design bureau in 1938 to the last aerial duel in the skies over Honduras, which came 3 decades after the first takeoff. There will be records no one else set. There will be a slaughter that entered history under a grim name. There will be captivity, a return, and revenge taken upon a Mustang. Get comfortable. This story is worth telling to the very end. 1938. The United States Navy announces a competition. It needs a new carrier fighter, and it needs one fast. The competitors do what every level-headed engineer does. They take existing Army machines and hastily adapt them for shipboard duty. Cheap, quick, predictable, and only one company spits on common sense. Chance Vought chooses a path no one else dared to take. Instead of one fighter, the engineers at Vought set out to build 2 at once. 2 fundamentally different aircraft, 2 power plants, 2 philosophies. This is not a hedge, it is a challenge. The first prototype receives a proven, reliable heart, the 14-cylinder Pratt Whitney Twin Wasp, 1,200 horsepower, an engine without surprises and without scandals. With a motor like that, you do not win, but neither do you crash on the test field. This relates to the key fork in the entire program, because the second prototype is an altogether different story. It is meant to carry the Pratt Whitney R-2800, which at that moment is only just wheezing through its bench trials. Raw, unrefined, barely run in, and at the same time, monstrously powerful. Even the earliest, first version of this engine puts out around 1,800 horsepower, 300 more than any American fighter of the era, a figure that took the designer's breath away. 46 liters of displacement, a twin star of 18 cylinders, a beast, not a motor. But everything has its price, and the cost of this power proves proportionate. The engine is heavy. It drags down the whole flying weight of the machine. More than that, to draw off such torque efficiently, you need a giant propeller. Not an ordinary one, but blades so long the diameter pushes past 4 meters. 4 meters of spinning steel in front of the nose of a carrier fighter that still has to land on the heaving deck of an aircraft carrier. How are you supposed to cram a wheel like that under the belly of a plane without snapping its landing gear struts? This relates to the very dilemma that decided everything. Reliability against power. Common sense against ambition. The safe, middle-of-the-road choice against the record breaker capable of taking a life on the test field. Any cautious manager would have chosen the first prototype. Quiet, understandable, forgiving of mistakes. Anyone but Vought. In the company's offices, they understand perfectly well what they are risking. A raw engine means blown deadlines, failed trials, a blow to reputation if the Navy contract drifts off to the competition. One miscalculation, and the whole program plunges into the abyss along with the money and the firm's name. But the temptation is too great. 1,800 horsepower is not merely a bonus. It is a bid for the fastest single-engine fighter in the country. It is a chance to outrun everyone at once, to leap over an entire generation of machines. And Vought places its bet. A company that could have taken the easy road deliberately chooses the hard one, the one with the greatest odds of breaking its own neck. Two prototypes stand in the workshops like two forks of fate. One promises calm, the other, glory or catastrophe. There is no third option. And the entire story that follows is an account of what happens when engineers stake everything on a raw, untamed, monstrously powerful engine that is not yet even properly learned to run. The decision rests with one man. Chief designer Rex Beisel looks at both prototypes and signs caution's death warrant. The choice falls on the second, the very one with the raw and dangerous R-2800. Beisel judged the risk justified, a short phrase, and behind it stands the fate of the whole program and the reputation of the firm. From this stroke of the pen, the real engineering drama begins.
Because a powerful engine immediately creates a problem that cannot be waved away. A giant motor needs a giant propeller, blades more than 4 meters across. And here, the entire arithmetic collapses. Mount a wheel like that on ordinary landing gear, and the blades will scrape the deck on touchdown. Raise the aircraft higher on long struts, and you get a wobbly structure, snapped at the first rough contact. A carrier fighter on towering legs is doomed. A vicious circle with, it seemed, no way out. This relates to the most elegant solution in the entire design of the machine. Beisel and his engineers did not raise the aircraft, they lowered the wing. The famous inverted gull configuration. The wing drops away from the fuselage, bending at a distinctive angle toward the ground, and from the lowest point of that bend grow short, sturdy landing gear struts. The propeller gets its clearance, and the plane's legs stay low and strong. One solution kills two birds at once. The blades never touch the deck, and the landing grows safer. It was this very bend that gave the Corsair its unmistakable, unrepeatable silhouette. But the powerful motor strikes more than the landing gear. 18 cylinders turning a 4-meter propeller create a monstrous reaction torque. The machine is literally driven to twist and roll about its own axis. On takeoff and at low speeds, this is lethally dangerous. The engineers answer with cold calculation. The entire tail assembly is offset 2 degrees to the left, a small trick, invisible to the eye, that smothers the parasitic torque and holds the aircraft straight. This relates to what Vought took particular pride in, the weight discipline of the structure. The machine is, quite literally, licked clean. Magnesium alloys, advanced for their time, go into the work, light yet strong. Joints are made with spot welding instead of heavy riveted seams. Every kilogram saved works for speed and maneuver. The result is an airframe in which aerodynamic perfection is paired with low weight. For the most powerful engine in the country, a shell worthy of it is created. In February of 1940, the full-scale mock-up stands before the Navy Commission. Exacting officers inspect the broken wing, the long cowling, the unfamiliar lines, and give their approval. The program receives a green light. Now, from drawings and a wooden mock-up to a real flight, there remains but a single step. And that step stretches across a year of strained labor. On the 29th of May, 1941, factory pilot Lyman Bullard climbs into the cockpit of the experimental machine. The engine comes alive, the 4-meter propeller carves the air, and the Corsair lifts from the ground for the first time. In the sky, an aircraft on which everything has been staked, the raw motor, the cunning wing, and Vaught's reputation. The bet is placed, the chips are on the table, and now the machine must prove what the audacity of its creators is worth. The newcomer began breaking records at once. On one of its very first flights, the experimental Corsair, with no visible effort, accelerated to 650 kilometers per hour. By the standards of 1941, the figure was staggering. No single-engine American fighter had ever flown that fast. Vaught's bet on the monstrous engine was paying off many times over. The machine was, quite literally, tearing through the air. But the real sensation awaited in the diving trials. Driving the aircraft into a steep descent, the pilots saw on their instruments something hard to believe. The Corsair came right up against the 900-kilometer mark of speed. For a piston machine of the early 40s, this was an outrageous, almost fantastical figure, on the very edge of what the structure could withstand at all.
Air at such speeds strikes the skin like a sledgehammer. This relates to one of the most strained episodes in the whole testing program. On pulling out of the dive, the G-loads and the onrushing stream proved stronger than the material. The prototype partly lost the fabric covering of its elevator. It was simply torn away by the oncoming flow. Any other machine in such a situation might have come apart in the air, but the Corsair held, and the pilot managed to keep control and safely land the wounded aircraft. The structure proved the margin of strength built into it by Vaught's engineers. So, before the Navy stood a fighter with outstanding figures, the fastest single-engine machine in the country, tough, able to endure an insane dive, ready, it seemed, to go into production and into battle the very next day. And here arises a question there is no escaping. Why then did such a promising machine begin reaching frontline units only 2 years later? 2 years. An entire eternity by the measure of a war already blazing across the ocean. The answer turned out to be insultingly simple. To blame was that very engine on which Vaught had staked everything. A raw, unrefined power plant. The R-2800 was a motor of gigantic potential, but at the start of its road it was temperamental, broke down, and served up one unpleasant surprise after another. Power had run up against reliability, and reliability was not there yet. This relates to the unenviable role that fell to the Corsair in particular. The F4U became the first aircraft in the world to receive this twin star from Pratt Whitney. First, meaning the test subject. Upon it fell the main weight of perfecting the new engine. All the motor's teething troubles, every stall, failure, and breakdown came to light on this machine. While the engineers at Pratt Whitney month after month hunted down the faults, a finished fighter, straining for the sky, stood on the ground. The price of this primacy proved high, but not in vain. By the middle of the Second World War, the engine's chief ailments were defeated, one after another. The R-2800 did not merely recover, it entered history as one of the finest piston-aero engines ever. That same motor which for 2 years kept the Corsair chained to the ground became, in the end, its greatest strength. The bet paid off, but the cost was 2 lost years, and on a war those do not come back. In June of 1942, production Corsairs at last began leaving the assembly line. But this was no longer the same aircraft that had taken off a year earlier. The machine had visibly transformed, and that transformation had come at no small cost. The military, scarcely having received their record breaker, immediately wanted more, and demanded the armament be completely recut. The most conspicuous difference was the rearward shift of the pilot's cockpit. The canopy moved farther toward the tail, noticeably altering the entire look of the fighter. Rex Beisel was forced into this measure in order to satisfy the customer's sudden and categorical wish. The Navy demanded that 6 heavy Colt Browning machine guns be placed in the wing. Not 4, as before, but 6 barrels, and with an impressive ammunition load at that. 2,500 rounds per volley. This relates to the very heart of the chain reaction that the new requirement set off. 6 machine guns with such a deluge of ammunition took up every free space in the wing, and the space they had to take was precisely the volume where fuel had previously been stored. There was simply nowhere left to put the tanks. A wing crammed with weapons to the brim could no longer hold the fuel. The engineers faced a problem with only one solution, and that solution promised trouble. The fuel was moved into the center section. The main tank relocated into the fuselage and stood directly in front of the pilot, in the bay between the engine and the cockpit. To free up room for the ammunition, the designers seated the pilot, in effect, astride a full barrel of fuel. It was for the sake of this very tank that the cockpit had to be shifted back. The logic was ironclad, the layout forced, and the consequences delayed. As would later become clear, this decision carried far-reaching consequences. The tank set before the pilot forever changed the view from the cockpit, the behavior of the machine, and its very reputation. What in the drawings of 1942 looked like a reasonable compromise would turn into one of the most painful traits of the Corsair's character. But at that moment, no one yet suspected it.
This relates to the overall picture of the haste in which the machine was being rushed into production.
The war would not wait. The front needed aircraft, and every new demand from the Navy had to be carried out on the move, reworking an already nearly finished design. 6 machine guns instead of 4, 2,500 rounds, a tank in front of the pilot, a shifted cockpit. All of it was the result of a single wish by the military to obtain a stronger, more toothsome machine. The wish was granted. The production F4U rolled out of the workshop formidable and heavily armed. 6 heavy barrels, the most powerful motor in the country, record speed, a sturdy airframe. On paper, the ideal carrier fighter, the dream of any Navy. It remained to test that dream in practice, to release it onto a carrier deck and see how the machine would behave where it was destined to fight. And here, the Corsair had prepared a bitter disappointment for its creators. The first trial flights from the carrier Saratoga turned into utter disappointment. The record breaker, the terror of the test fields, on the deck suddenly turned into a vicious and disobedient beast. Everything Vought had taken pride in turned, on the heaving carrier deck, against the machine itself. Shipboard service laid bare flaws invisible at a land airfield. The first misfortune came from the very place the designers themselves had sown it. The lengthy cowling, beneath which hid the giant motor, together with the rearward shifted cockpit, blocked the forward view entirely. On landing, at the most critical moment, the pilot simply could not see the deck right in front of him. The huge nose pitched upward and blinded the airman, turning a straight approach into a deadly lottery. A machine able to reach record speeds could not properly land on its own ship. This relates to a whole chain of flaws, each worse than the last. Second on the list came the landing gear shock absorbers. Too stiff, too unyielding.
On touching the deck, the Corsair did not soften the blow, but bounced off the planking like a ball. The heavy fighter leapt back into the air, skipped over the arrestor cables, and again struck the wood roughly with its wheels. Every such landing became a fight for survival in which the pilot could lose at any second. But the most sinister flaw proved to be the third. On reaching landing speed, at low altitude, right at the edge of the deck, the Corsair would suddenly stall onto a wing. The left plane, without warning, lost its lift, and the machine pitched sharply to the side. In a high-speed dive, such a temper can still be forgiven. There is a reserve of altitude there. But a few meters above the deck, at the moment of touchdown, this stall left the pilot not a single chance to correct the error. The country's fastest carrier fighter proved lethally dangerous in precisely the role of a carrier fighter. This relates to the outcome many had already sensed coming.
The Navy drew its line. Weighing the record figures on one scale and the murderous behavior near the deck on the other, the command, over the long term, made its choice against the Corsair. The fleet's carrier fighter was named the product of the competitors at Grumman, the calmer, more obedient, more forgiving F-6F Hellcat. The machine with the inferior flight figures defeated the machine with the superior ones, and here the Corsair's fate made its principal turn. The aircraft was not scrapped, nor rejected outright. It was exiled. From now on, every F4U built, despite its higher characteristics, was routed past the carrier decks, straight into the squadrons of the Marine Corps. A fighter created for the carrier was barred from the carrier. The better machine went off to fight from land airfields, yielding the shipboard deck to a weaker rival. The paradox of this decision is hard to overstate. The Marine Corps received at its disposal the fastest single-engine fighter of the United States, not through the command's generosity, but because the Navy did not know how to tame its temper near the deck. What was conceived as banishment and a sentence turned, for the Corsair, into an unexpected chance. It was over the islands of the Pacific, far from the carrier decks, that this machine would begin to write its true combat biography. On the 14th of February, 1943, the Marine Corps Squadron VMF-124 took its first battle. St. Valentine's Day, the Feast of Lovers, entered the history of the Corsair forever as the day of a brutal, humiliating rout. The machine praised for its record figures, in its very first real action, choked on the blood of its own pilots. The task seemed routine. The fighters had flown out to escort bombers as part of a large mixed air group. The formation moved over the waters of the southern Pacific, not far from the strait by the island of Bougainville. Young Marine airmen were leading their brand new F4Us into combat for the first time, and behind them lay very few flight hours on the temperamental machine. Experience was catastrophically lacking. This relates to the most vulnerable spot in the Americans' preparation: coordination and vigilance in the air. The Japanese appeared suddenly. The formation was intercepted by roughly 50 enemy carrier fighters, and the attack caught the Americans off guard. They simply missed the threat, failed to spot the enemy in time, and the Japanese pilots crashed down upon the formation from above, out of the sun, from the most advantageous position for attack. In a matter of minutes, the orderly battle array turned into a melee. What happened next gave this battle its terrible nickname.
In English-language literature, the clash was not without reason called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The Americans lost 10 of their aircraft in a matter of minutes. 10 machines in one short, feverish fight. Experienced Japanese pilots on their nimble fighters shot down the clumsy novices almost with impunity, exploiting their numerical edge, the element of surprise, and their own combat experience. This relates to the bitterest part of that arithmetic. The enemy's losses, against the backdrop of the American rout, looked mockingly modest. Just 3 downed enemy machines. 10 against 3. That was the price the Corsair paid for its combat debut. A ratio one wants to look away from. The machine on which so many hopes had been placed lost its very first battle outright, and lost it humiliatingly. One might think, what further verdict could be needed? The country's fastest carrier fighter, rejected by its own navy, had now failed the combat examination with a crash.
The skeptics who had curled their lips at the sight of the broken wing were triumphant. Here it is, the price of Vort's ambitions. Here is what all those speed records are worth, if in real battle the machine perishes by the dozen without inflicting even comparable losses on the enemy. This relates to the trap people fall into when judging equipment by first impressions. The matter lay not in the machine itself. 10 lost fighters were the payment not for design flaws, but for inexperience, for the absence of tactics, for the inability to use the new aircraft's strengths. The young pilots threw themselves into a turning carousel against an enemy that had no equal in precisely that close maneuvering fight. They fought by another's rules, on another's field, and lost as a matter of course. The Japanese, A6M0, was an unsurpassed master of the turn. Light, nimble, obedient, it twisted any maneuvering battle to its own advantage and would literally get onto the tail of anyone who tried to outplay it in a turn. The heavy inert Corsair, stuffed with weapons and fuel, was anything you like except a circus acrobat. To try to beat the Zero in its own element, in a carousel of turns at low altitude, meant signing one's own sentence. This was precisely the mistake the airmen of VMF 124 made. The lesson of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was paid for at a fearful price, but it was this very lesson that had to be learned. 10 lost machines screamed of one thing: the Corsair could not be fought the way they were used to. A different tactic was needed, a different head, a different approach to the very essence of air combat. The machine possessed colossal potential, but that potential still had to be unlocked. For now, the shadow of the most shameful debut imaginable hung over the squadrons of the Marine Corps. The rout on St. Valentine's Day could have put an end to the Corsair's combat career, but the opposite happened. The Marine pilots drew cold, sober conclusions from the catastrophe, and quite literally on the move, rewrote the rules of air combat. The turning point came swiftly, and it came not in the design bureau, but in the head of the airmen. The chief revelation was simple and merciless.
To fight the Zero on its own terms was suicide, which meant those terms had simply to be cancelled. The Americans stopped getting drawn into the turning carousel and imposed their own game on the enemy. They built their entire tactic on two trump cards the Japanese machine did not and could not have: speed and the power of the dive. This relates to the very essence of the new approach, which entered history under the name hit and run. The scheme was honed to perfection. The Corsair took position above the enemy, accumulated altitude and speed, then plunged downward in a hurtling attack.
One lightning pass, a short burst from 6 heavy barrels, and the machine climbed away on its reserve of speed, giving the Zero not the slightest chance to latch onto it in a turn. The Japanese pilot saw the target before him for only a fraction of a second, after which it vanished into the heights. He could not catch the Corsair, nor force it into a turn. The superiority in numbers was decisive. In top speed, the F4U left the A6M50 far behind, and in the dive, the gap became an outright chasm. The heavy, sturdy American machine plunged downward like a stone and accelerated to speeds at which the light Japanese plane risked simply coming apart in the air. The Zero could neither catch the Corsair in a dive nor safely follow it. Where the Japanese sought salvation in a steep descent, ruin overtook him. The structure would not hold such speeds. This relates to the harsh code of rules the pilots had learned through the blood of their predecessors.
Maneuvering combat at low altitude was now under the strictest prohibition. The reason lay in the very character of the machine. Having bled off its speed, below 3,000 meters, the Corsair turned into an inert, unwieldy hulk. The heavy fighter lost to the nimble Japanese in rate of climb and in acceleration. It simply lacked the briskness to contend with the Zero down low. To descend to the ground and accept battle there in turns meant voluntarily handing the enemy every advantage. So the formula for survival sounded short and clear. Keep your altitude, keep your speed, strike from above, and climb away. Do not let yourself be dragged down. Do not waste energy in pointless turns. Do not try to outmaneuver one who cannot be outmaneuvered. Fight with your head, not your reflexes. Whoever mastered these rules turned from prey into hunter, and the result was not long in coming. That very Marine Corps squadron VMF-124, which had survived the shameful debut, in just 2 months of fighting, completely rewrote its statistics. To its credit, fell 68 downed enemy aircraft, 68 victories against its own losses of only 11 fighters. Compare that ratio with the 10 against 3 of the first battle, and the scale of the turnaround becomes obvious. This relates to the chief lesson of the whole story of the Corsair as a war machine. The same squadron, the same aircraft, the same enemy, and the outcome directly opposite. Only one thing had changed. People had learned to understand the machine and to use precisely its strengths rather than fighting against its nature. The flaws that near the deck had seemed a sentence turned, at high altitude, into formidable virtues. The heavy inertia that left the Corsair helpless down low became, at altitude, an unstoppable energy of the dive.
The powerful motor that had caused so much trouble during its perfecting, now, time after time, carried the pilot out of battle alive. The machine had at last found its element, the swift, high-altitude, fleeting fight in which the victor is not the most agile, but the fastest and most calculating. From this moment, the Corsair ceased to be prey and began to gather its own formidable reputation. Every legendary machine has its legendary pilot. For the Corsair, it was Major Gregory Boyington, nicknamed Pappy. An officer no longer young by the measure of war, a man of a heavy, unaccommodating temper, he seemed cut from the same stubborn metal as his temperamental aircraft. A machine with a bad character had found itself a commander to match. Boyington could not hold his tongue, and it cost him his career. Sharp, insolent, deferring neither to superiors nor to the chain of command, he made enemies faster than he downed enemy aircraft.
Until the middle of 1943, the combat pilot, in his own caustic words, wore out his trousers at headquarters, kept away from any real work. A pilot's talent stood idle while war raged all around, and a man with the makings of a great ace shuffled papers in the rear. This relates to one of the most unexpected turns in his fate.
When the long-awaited permission was at last granted, Boyington threw himself into the work with the fury of a man whose hands had been bound for too long. In short order, he forged a combat unit out of scattered, unsettled airmen, the 214th Fighter Squadron. These were pilots without a place, without a reputation, without famous names, and the commander himself jokingly christened them the Black Sheep, the mangy sheep that no respectable flock would take in. The emblem bearing this brazen nickname was painted onto the cowlings of their Corsairs.
The Black Sheep sank their teeth into the most terrible target on the entire theater of operations, Rabaul. This mightiest base of the Japanese Air Forces was a veritable wasp's nest, shielded by hundreds of aircraft and dense anti-aircraft defenses. To poke one's nose in there meant climbing into the inferno. It was precisely there, in the skies over Rabaul, that Boyington's squadron unfolded its full might. This relates to figures that speak for themselves. In just 84 days of fighting, the Black Sheep destroyed and heavily damaged over 200 enemy machines, 200 enemy aircraft in under 3 months, a result that takes the breath away. And 22 of those victories the commander credited personally to his own account. Boyington did not sit out behind the backs of his subordinates. He led them into battle himself, setting the example of that very high-altitude, high-speed hunt the Corsair pilots had mastered. But war spares not even the best.
On the 4th of January 1944, the stricken Corsair of Gregory Boyington plunged into the waters of the Pacific. The machine of the Black Sheep commander vanished into the waves, and at first it seemed that for the brave major all was over. For a long time there was not the slightest news of his fate. His comrades in arms counted him among those who did not return from the mission. The homeland mourned a fallen ace. This relates to an outcome that was hard to believe. After the war's end, it emerged that Boyington was alive. The wounded pilot had miraculously survived that crash, had been picked up by the enemy, and had spent 1.5 years in captivity. 1.5 years of obscurity, deprivation, and uncertainty, there, where he had long since been buried in absentia. And all that time the man considered lost held on, waited, and believed that he would return. Gregory Boyington came back to his homeland.
The story of a man with an insufferable temper, barred from the fighting, and then creating one of the most productive squadrons of the war, reached its conclusion, and a happy conclusion at that. The commander, mentally buried by his own side, passed through captivity and stepped back to his comrades. His fate intertwined with the fate of the Corsair so closely that the one became inseparable from the other. A machine with a bad temper and a pilot with a bad temper, together inscribing one of the brightest pages in the combat chronicle of the Pacific. In the figure of Boyington, as in a mirror, was reflected the whole character of his aircraft. Both were inconvenient, both irritated their superiors, both long awaited their hour away from any real work, and both, once their hour came, proved that to write them off had been an unforgivable mistake. Pappy Boyington and his broken-winged fighter became a symbol of a stubborn strength that could be broken neither by the Navy's rejection, nor by the disgrace of the first battle, nor even by 1.5 years of captivity. While battles thundered over the islands of the Pacific, far in the rear, the engineers of Vought were waging a fight of their own, against the flaws of their own machine. That very murderous view on landing, that very blindness that had barred the Corsair from the deck, gave the designers no peace. The result of their painstaking labor was the deeply reworked F4U-1A modification. The changes aimed straight at the sore spot. The former flat canopy, low and cramped, gave way to a new one, bulged, raised, granting the pilot a far wider view to the sides and forward. More than that, the pilot's seat itself was raised 18 centimeters higher than before.
18 centimeters, a trifle on the drawing, but it was precisely these centimeters that lifted the pilot's head above the long cowling and gave him back what he had so lacked on the Saratoga: the ability to see where he was landing. This relates not only to the view, but to the very heart of the machine. The reworked engine now permitted a 5-minute boost, a brief regime of maximum power.
The pilot could, for a short time, wring everything from the motor, gaining around 40 kilometers per hour atop an already record speed. In the fleeting high-altitude battle, where everything is decided by seconds and a few extra meters of altitude, such a reserve became the difference between victory and ruin. The machine grew faster still and more dangerous still. And at that same time, an idea was born that was destined to overturn the entire fate of the Corsair. Part of the fighters were, as an experiment, fitted with bomb racks.
An aircraft created as a pure fighter began to be tried on for the role of a strike machine, a carrier of bombs for work against ground targets. The idea was tempting, but it required testing in real conditions, and for that test, a truly legendary figure stepped onto the stage. This relates to one of the loudest names in the aviation of the 20th century. To the trials, they brought Charles Lindbergh, the very man who in 1927 was the first to fly the Atlantic solo and became a living legend on both continents. By 1944, the celebrated aviator, a civilian by status, set off on a tour of the combat squadrons of the Pacific to help the pilots, in practice, wring the maximum from their equipment. What Lindbergh demonstrated in the skies over the islands overturned all former notions of the machine's capabilities. The military believed the Corsair capable of lifting a rather modest bomb load.
Lindbergh proved the opposite, and proved it not in words, but in dozens of real sorties. Confidently piloting the fighter, he raised it into the air time after time with a load that few had at first believed in. Beneath the wing and fuselage of the machine hung nearly 2 tons of bombs. This relates to the very core of the sensation Lindbergh created. 2 tons was double, and at times more, what had previously been considered the limit for a single-engine fighter. The machine rejected as a carrier fighter proved, in fact, to be a mighty strike aircraft whose potential had simply been underestimated. The celebrated pilot uncovered a hidden reserve of the design that even its creators had not suspected. Charles Lindbergh's experiment did not remain a fine stunt. It led directly to the appearance of a full-fledged fighter-bomber version, the F4U-1D. This machine received additional armor, shielding the pilot in the dangerous work near the ground, and numerous pylons for mounting rocket and bomb armament. From a pure fighter, the Corsair turned into a formidable all-rounder, equally dangerous in air combat and in striking ground targets. And then occurred what only recently had been impossible to believe. At roughly this same time, the United States Navy at last lifted the ban on operating the Corsair from the decks of its own carriers. The machine that had been disgracefully exiled to the land airfields of the Marine Corps was returning to the very place from which it had once been driven. The outcast was granted the right to return to the ship. But who, then, had managed to prove to the Navy that the temperamental fighter could after all be tamed on the deck? The answer came from an entirely unexpected quarter, from across the ocean, from the Allies. The answer came from Britain. What American engineers and admirals had struggled over for years, the English solved quickly, cheaply, and almost mockingly simply. Over the years of the war, under the Lend-Lease Agreement, Great Britain received more than 2,000 fighters with the broken wing, and, what is especially telling, the majority of them operated not from huge strike carriers, but from relatively small British ships. It looked like a mockery of common sense. The temperamental machine that its own navy had feared to release from the spacious decks of the Saratoga, the British set down on the cramped decks of small carriers, there, where there was no right to error at all. How did such a thing even prove possible? In what way did the Royal Airmen differ from their American colleagues, who 2 years earlier had judged the Corsair unfit for shipboard service? This relates to one of those solutions before which one wants to take off one's hat. All things ingenious are simple. The Americans had tried to land the machine straight, approaching the deck head-on, and it was precisely then that the long cowling tightly blocked the view at the most critical moment. The British abandoned the straight approach entirely. Instead, they came in to land along a curve, sideways, in a slip, turning the machine so that the nose was led off to the side of the line of travel.
Thanks to this cunning turn, the signal officer on the ship's deck remained within the pilot's field of view right up to the very last instant. The airman, to the very end, could see both the deck and the man guiding him in. The problem of the blind cowling evaporated. Not at the cost of reworking the design, but at the cost of changing the trajectory. The machine's second long-standing ailment, the British mechanics swatted down with the same elegant simplicity.
The Corsair chronically suffered from spattering oil over the canopy. Oil from the upper part of the engine bay flew straight onto the glazing, clouding the view in mid-flight. The engineers might have spent months seeking a complex technical solution. The Royal Navy mechanics did otherwise. They simply fixed shut, for good, the cooling louvers of the upper part of the engine bay. They blocked the path by which oil was thrown onto the canopy, and the problem vanished. Crude, cheap, foolproof. This relates to the bitter irony of the whole Corsair story. The British Allies, in a matter of months, tamed the machine that its native navy had for 2 years considered untamable. It was their success, in no small measure, that pushed the Americans to lift the ban on operating the fighter from their own decks. Another's hands proved what their own had not believed, and the machine, meanwhile, was reaching the peak of its form. The last of the mass modifications to catch the Second World War was the F4U-4. The motor was boosted by a further 400 horsepower and paired with a new 4-bladed propeller. The result staggered the imagination. A 6-ton war machine accelerated to 720 kilometers per hour. At this speed, the Corsair outpaced its sworn rival by more than 50 kilometers per hour, that very F-6F Hellcat to which the deck had once been given in its place. The outcast proved faster than the victor, and yet for all these virtues, a price had to be paid. For its heavy, stubborn temper and high accident rate, the Corsair earned among the pilots a grim nickname, the Ensign Eliminator. The machine forgave no mistakes and punished inexperienced pilots without mercy. Let a young airman grow careless on landing, lose speed at the wrong moment, or move the stick too sharply, and the formidable fighter turned against its own master. This relates to a statistic that sounds like a sentence. For every machine lost in combat with the enemy, 1.5 were wrecked through errors of piloting. 1.5. Meaning one's own deck, one's own airfield, and one's own inexperience ruined the Corsair more often than enemy fire. The fastest carrier fighter of its time was at once one of the most dangerous for those only just mastering its temperamental character. Formidable to the foe and merciless to the novice. Thus, the Corsair entered combat legend. By the start of 1945, something had occurred that only 2 years earlier would have seemed unthinkable. All the principal carrier formations of the United States bore on their decks a single type of fighter, that very Corsair which the Navy had once disgracefully exiled to land airfields. The outcast had not merely returned to the ships, it had crowded out all rivals and become master of the American decks from one edge of the Pacific to the other. By this moment, the war in the air had already nearly died down. The enemy had practically no combat-capable aviation left. The best pilots had not returned from past battles. The factories lay in ruins. Fuel was short even for training flights. The aerial duels in which the Corsair had honed its high-altitude tactics were passing into the past. Before the renewed machines stood 2 entirely new tasks, and both were tied not to classic air combat. This relates to the most terrible weapon of the war's closing stage in the Pacific, the kamikaze attacks. Deprived of normal aviation, the enemy staked everything on suicide pilots who guided their explosive-laden machines straight at the American ships. Only a dense fighter screen over the fleet could halt this wave. And here the Corsair's record speed, its powerful armament of 6 barrels, and its sturdy structure proved exactly right. The machine intercepted the attackers on their approach, breaking up their formation long before they could reach the decks. The second task was more important still. The Corsair turned into the principal instrument of close support for landing operations. While the Marines stormed fortified islands, the fighters with the broken wing hung over the battlefield, raining bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire down upon the enemy's defenses. That very strike role uncovered by Lindbergh now became the machine's chief calling. And in both roles, as a kamikaze interceptor and as a support attacker, the Corsair proved itself more than worthy. This relates to the dual nature of this machine's whole combat reputation. The arguments over how good the Corsair was precisely as a fighter, as a hunter of enemy aircraft, do not subside to this very day. Some extol its record victory tallies, others recall the shameful debut and the temperamental nature. But there is one area in which the machine can bear, and could bear, no reproach at all. The Corsair's contribution to the close support of troops on the front line remains unshakable. Here there is nothing to argue about. The figures speak for themselves. And here are those figures. By post-war counts, over the years of the Second World War, the Corsairs flew 64,000 sorties. 64,000 times the broken wing rose into the sky over the Pacific. In air battles, machines of this type destroyed 2,140 enemy aircraft. 2,140 downed, an impressive tally for a fighter that began with a rout of 10 against 3. This relates to the side of the matter where the Corsair was truly unsurpassed. Over the course of the war, these machines dropped 15,000 tons of bombs on enemy positions. 15,000 tons of deadly cargo brought down upon fortifications, equipment, and the enemy's manpower. And the Corsair's share in strike operations on the front line exceeded 85%. Take in that figure. More than 8 of every 10 airstrikes directly over the battlefield fell precisely to the machines with the broken wing. The fighter rejected as a carrier aircraft had become the chief strike force of naval aviation. Knowing all this, one is no longer surprised by what followed. The piston Corsair, unlike a great many of its contemporaries, no one rushed to scrap with the arrival of the jet age. The machine that had begun the war an outcast was ending it as the fleet's indispensable workhorse. The aircraft denied the right to a deck stood by the war's finale on every deck and carried upon itself the main weight of the strike work. This relates to the chief paradox of the Corsair's whole fate, which by the war's end had emerged in full.
The fastest carrier fighter of its time truly came into its own not in the role of the high-speed hunter for which it had been created, but in the role of the heavy-hauling attacker that at first no one had even contemplated. The machine found its true purpose away from its original design. And it was precisely this purpose, the support of those who went into battle on the ground, that secured it a long life. The war in Europe and the Pacific had ended. The weapons were falling silent. Millions of people were returning home. One might think that here the combat biography of the piston fighter ought to have drawn to a close. The age of propeller machines was passing. The era of jet speed was coming on. But the story of the Corsair was far from finished. The most astonishing chapter in this machine's fate awaited it after the Great War, when the world, having scarcely caught its breath, plunged once more into new conflicts.
And there, in the sky of a new war, the broken wing appeared again. The era of jet aviation was coming on, but the Corsair had no thought of retiring. Knowing all that the machine had managed to do over the past war, no one rushed to send it to the scrapyard. On the contrary, work on modernizing the piston veteran continued at full pace. In April of 1946, a brand new F4U-5 left the assembly line. This modification gained around 30 kilometers per hour in speed, but something else proved far more important. The fighter had at last shed a significant part of its temperamental nature. The machine acquired automatic flap control devices and an automated engine cooling system, those very conveniences the pilots of earlier versions had so lacked. What had previously demanded constant attention and experience was now taken over by automation, and the formidable Ensign Eliminator grew noticeably more docile. This relates to the very structure, which stepped into a new age. The outdated fabric covering of the control surfaces and wing panels finally gave way to metal. The armament changed as well. In place of machine guns came 4 20mm cannon, which became the standard from then on. The F4U-5 and its specialized night modification, the F4U-5N, enjoyed steady demand far beyond the borders of the United States. About 100 such fighters were bought by the air forces of France, and together with French crews, The machine passed through a whole chain of conflicts in Southeast Asia and North Africa. But the Corsair's participation in the Korean conflict deserves a separate discussion of its own. The next war for the broken wing began at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd of July, 1950. 16 fighters, part of a strike group from the carrier Valley Forge, struck an airfield near Pyongyang. Coming in the second wave, the Corsairs reached the target when the hangars and runways had already been wrecked by the first raid. This relates to how the machine, quite literally, finished off the enemy on the ground. The Corsair's blow fell upon the enemy's surviving aircraft, standing on the shattered airfield. The reports of the returning airmen spoke of 38 destroyed and 27 damaged aircraft of various types. The result proved crushing. In under 3 hours of combat work, the aviation of North Korea as an organized force effectively ceased to exist. One morning raid crossed an entire air force out of the equation of war. Yet the Corsair's true strength was revealed not in the sky, but over the battlefield. To an even greater degree, the machine shaped the character of the ground struggle. In fierce engagements, it often happened that support for just a single battalion of Marines was rendered simultaneously by up to 50 machines with the broken wing. 50 Corsairs over the heads of their infantrymen. That was a solid wall of fire, plowing up the enemy's positions. The effectiveness of this support was so high that by the end of August, the enemy was forced to abandon offensive operations entirely during the daylight hours. This relates to the fact that Night 2 brought the North Korean troops no peace. After sunset, the 513th Air Group, operating from airfields in Japan, took up patrol along the 38th parallel. Its pilots used the special all-weather modification F4U-5N, additionally fitted with a de-icing system and radar equipment. Now the broken wing hung over the enemy around the clock, by day and by night, in clear weather and in foul. There was nowhere to hide from it. The golden page of the machine's entire combat biography was its sorties in support of the 1st Marine Division, encircled in a tight ring by the Chinese Army at the Chosin Reservoir. The position of the surrounded men seemed hopeless. For all 12 days, while the Marines fought their way through heavy battles toward the saving coast, dozens of Corsairs circled ceaselessly overhead. And these machines not only provided direct fire support and reconnaissance, they dropped ammunition and supplies to the encircled men, sustaining in them the very capacity to resist. The broken wing became for the division both shield and provider at once. This relates to the appearance of the last, special version of the machine. Mindful of all the Corsair services, in 1952, a purely strike modification was born, the AU-1. No one demanded speed records of it any longer, and the designers took full advantage of this. All the machine's vulnerable spots were reliably covered with 300 kilograms of armor. But even that is not the astonishing part. For all its heavy protection, the AU-1 was able to set out on a combat mission carrying 2.5 tons of deadly cargo beneath its wing. 26 squadrons of Corsairs in the skies of the Korean peninsula performed a colossal volume of work. It is enough to say that the intensity of their use substantially exceeded that of the preceding World War. But for this intensity, a higher price had to be paid as well. From combat missions in Korea, 360 machines with the broken wing did not return. And in all, over 10 years of production, the factories of 3 firms, Vought, Brewster and Goodyear, built 12,571 fighters of this type. The machine that had once nearly been buried after its first battle served 2 decades and passed through 2 great wars. And now of something almost impossible to believe. The last combat sortie of this legendary machine took place nearly 3 decades after its first takeoff. While in the skies of the superpowers, jet fighters had long held sway. Somewhere on the margins of great power politics, the broken wing of the Corsair rose into its latest, most improbable battle. It happened in Central America. On the 17th of July, 1969, during a short conflict between Honduras and El Salvador, a Honduran Corsair of the AU-1 modification rose into the sky. At its controls sat Captain Fernandez. What he accomplished that day entered the history of aviation forever as the final chord in the combat biography of piston fighters. This relates to one of the most astonishing results the age of propeller machines ever knew. In 2 aerial duels, Fernandez downed 3 enemy aircraft.
3 victories in a single day on a machine whose first flight had taken place even before the start of the Second World War. But that is not all. Among his quarry were not only other Corsairs, but also a Mustang fighter, that very celebrated American machine, one of the symbols of the Allies' air power. Take in this paradox. The Corsair, which had once yielded its place on the deck to its rival the Hellcat, at the twilight of its long life settled the score with another legend of the American sky. The broken wing bested a Mustang in honest air combat, 28 years after it first lifted from the ground. Thus ended the age of piston fighters, not in the skies of the world powers, but over a small war in Central America. And it was the Corsair that ended it. This relates to the final verdict that history has passed on this remarkable machine. Before us is indeed one of the most beautiful fighters of its time. Its flight characteristics remained consistently high throughout the whole of the Second World War. It was fast, powerful, and dangerous from the first day of the Great War to the last. And yet the Corsair never fully unlocked its vast potential precisely as a fighter. 2 things stood in the way. The first, the temperamental raw power plant, whose perfecting stole 2 whole years from the machine, and at the same time endowed it with a heavy, unyielding temper. The second, the powerful opposition of the Grumman firm, whose obedient Hellcat intercepted from the Corsair both the deck and the glory of the fleet's chief fighter. The machine, superior in characteristics, lost its struggle not to the enemy in the air, but to its own motor and to a calculating competitor on the ground. One might say that time played a truly cruel trick on this outstanding machine. The Corsair arrived late to one war and proved morally obsolete in another. For the start of the Second World War, it was not ready, owing to the endless perfecting of the engine, and by the height of the next conflict, the piston age was already living out its last days against the backdrop of jet speeds.
The fastest carrier fighter of its time never became what it was conceived to be, the terror of air battles. Instead, it proved truly in demand only as a support aircraft, as a heavy hauler of war, as an indispensable workhorse over the battlefield. This relates to the very essence of the duality with which we began our story. The admiration of some and the condescending smirk of others. Both of these judgments proved, each in its own way, just. Before us is both the brilliant record breaker and the temperamental Ensign Eliminator, both the rejected outcast and the savior of an encircled division, both the fighter that arrived late to its war and the warrior that outlived all the jet novelties of its time and put a full stop to an entire aviation epic. One machine, one silhouette, one fate, and so many contradictions at once. Such is the story of the F4U Corsair, a machine its own pilots feared and its own navy did not want. A fighter that began with a shameful rout and ended by besting a Mustang in 1969 in the last duel of the piston age. An aircraft that ran ahead of its time and arrived late to it at once. The broken wing carried its formidable and contradictory glory through 2 great wars and 3 decades, and passed into history undefeated. Friends, thank you for being with me to the very end of this story. If the tale of the Corsair's fate gripped you, support the channel, leave a rating, and subscribe so as not to miss new material on the legends of military aviation. Ahead lie many more machines whose fates deserve a story of their own. Peace to all, and we will hear one another again very soon. And here our story of the F4U Corsair comes to an end. A machine its own navy feared passed through 2 great wars, 3 decades, and thousands of battles, and went down in history undefeated. If this tale gripped you from the first word to the last, do not leave in silence. Hit the like button under this video. It is the best thanks for the work done and a signal that stories of military aviation like this are what you want. Subscribe to the channel if you have not yet done so. Ahead lie many more legendary machines whose fates deserve a story of their own. And be sure to tap the bell beside the subscribe button. That way you will be the first to learn of every new release and will not miss a single story. Write in the comments what you think of the Corsair, a brilliant machine ahead of its time, or a temperamental outcast that simply got lucky. Your opinions and your stories are what make it worth continuing. Peace to all, and we will hear one another again very soon.